Hi guys, it is high time for the second part of my April wrap-up. I read quite a few books in the second half of April. This will be different in May because I have remembered that I actually have things to do. But for now, I have 7 books to talk about. By far the most interesting book that I read in the second half of April was Now We Shall Be Entirely Free by Andrew Miller. This had been on my radar for some time because of its phenomenal title and also because it was shortlisted for the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction in 2019. And this is also how I became aware of it in the first place. This has remained relatively obscure, which is a shame because it is so well done. The story begins in 1809 with a young soldier, a cavalry officer, who is brought unconscious into his house where the housekeeper is currently the sole occupant. He has minor wounds, but most of all, he is almost dead from exhaustion. And the housekeeper nurses him back to health, and when he is recovered a bit, he makes plans to travel away, first to his sister in Bristol, and from there by ship to Glasgow, and at the end to one of the Western Isles of Scotland. We don't know what it is that he is fleeing from at first, but the story then quickly moves to Spain, where our protagonist served in the war against Napoleon, and where there has been an incident where British soldiers on retreat burned a village to the ground and killed and raped and mutilated the inhabitants. This particular village, I think, is fictitious, but incidents like that are well documented. The most famous one, I think, is the slaughter after the siege and conquest of Badajoz. So now we, the reader, are witnessing an inquiry that is held by a tribunal that consists of some high-ranking army officials who are trying to establish what happened, and the result is that an assassin is sent after our protagonist in Britain. Now, the way the inquiry is conducted smells of a sham, and we get the sense that what is uncovered there is not the whole truth, and that the way the judges or examiners are conducting the inquiry is designed to mislead and to yield certain results that they deem desirable, and that maybe they are making a scapegoat out of our protagonist back in England. And the author quite deliberately gives part of the solution to this riddle away by having named his key characters after certain participants in the My Lai massacre. And one of the main characters also talks in a decidedly modern way, maybe even imitates the speech patterns of the person after whom he was named, but I don't know enough about that to be able to tell for sure. All of this serves to highlight the ubiquity in time as well as place of war crimes, of crimes committed against civilians in wartime. And it also highlights the timeless nature of how those crimes are dealt with and how justice is served or not served as it happens. However, all those modern elements and references don't shatter the illusion of the historical setting, and in no way does the book read like a wild jumble of time strata. On the contrary, it is very careful in its depiction of life in the early 1800s, and it pays a lot of attention to details. So the book does satisfy that historical fiction itch that you might be wanting to scratch. But it is very openly and decidedly a mirror of more recent decades as well. However, there was one thing about how the story developed that I found rather problematic. The whole issue of the massacre of the civilians pretty soon fades into the background, a little too much in my opinion. The protagonist is very successful in pushing memories of it out of his conscious thoughts and only confronts his past at the very end of the book. And when he does, there is instant redemption. And not only that, there is also even the promise that the whole issue won't be brought up again in the future. And this way of dealing with things like that seems to be so counterproductive for the prevention of incidents like that. Experience seems to suggest that in the case of humanitarian disasters, dealing with and reckoning with the past cannot be a one-time action if it is supposed to have a lasting effect on the future. And it seems that as a society, we can only get past things like that if we keep the memory of them and the discussion of them alive. So it seems so problematic to advertise radical forgiveness and new beginnings in such a way. So that left a bit of a bitter aftertaste in my mouth. But on the whole, like I said, I thought it was a very well done book. And I also think that it does a good job at showing how incidents like that happen and who the people are who commit crimes like that. On the whole, I'd recommend it to anybody who has even the slightest interest in historical fiction, or at least historical fiction set in this period. I then read Paul Muldoon's poetry collection, Meeting the British, and this was published in 1987, which is also the year in which Paul Muldoon emigrated from Ireland to the United States to teach at Princeton. I already said in my last book haul, where I hauled this book, that Paul Muldoon is of a generation of poets with whom I seem to share the least connection of all the poets. So their poetry is the least accessible to me, because with younger poets I share a lot of the experiences, or at the very least I am familiar with the world and the society that they are writing in and about. And with older poets, at least, I seem to share a lot of the educational background. But not so much with this generation. But of course, a difference like that can also be very interesting. But in this case, none of the poems really spoke to me or caught my attention, or very few did. And the reason for that, I think, was that it seemed to me that when Paul Muldoon was writing these poems, he was already in comfortable early middle age and in a comfortable position. He was already lecturing at either Oxford or Cambridge, I don't remember, and like I said earlier, he was emigrating to the US to lecture in Princeton. And it seemed to me that, at least at this point, writing poetry was more or less a hobby for him, as opposed to a necessity. And the poems lacked the sense of urgency and the big, or at least deep, feelings that I want from poetry. So I thought that the poems were all a bit lukewarm in this and left me feeling rather indifferent. I then collected and DNF'd The Crossing Places by Elly Griffiths all in one day, unfortunately, but at least I got it used. This should have been great. It is a crime novel, a murder mystery, set in a small town in Norfolk on the North Sea coast, and the protagonist is not a police detective, but a forensic archaeologist for a change. But my heart sank when I opened it on page 1 and saw that it is written in the present tense. And me and present tense just don't get along in non-experimental novels, and especially not in English. It seems to not only yield itself to dull writing, but to downright demand dull writing. Bob goes into a room. Bob does a thing. Bob walks out of the room. He has a feeling. It's just completely unattractive to me. I should have learned my lesson by now. I normally look up every book online, and I look up a preview and check if it is written in the present tense. And if it is and the writing style is not experimental, I stay away from it. But every now and again I forget. Anyway, the present tense wasn't the only problem with this book. The book opens with the morning routine of the protagonist, the forensic archaeologist called Ruth Galloway, who is the protagonist of this crime series. And It starts with a meditation of the protagonist on her weight, her pudginess, and her boring clothes, and her general middle-aged dullness. And while that might be quite realistic, actually, it is also pretty boring. And I also had the nagging suspicion that the author might have done that, maybe even subconsciously, to ingratiate herself or her main character with the demographic that makes up a large part of her readership. And that just seemed cheap. So both of these problems combined made this book completely unattractive to me, so I decided to DNF this on page 2 and have a little rant about it. I then finished Bloody Scotland, which I had been reading since the beginning of the year because it is a short story collection, a collection of crime short stories that are all set on heritage sites around Scotland. For instance, Edinburgh Castle, Forth Bridge, the Neolithic tomb on Orkney, Victorian mills and lighthouses, etc. They are all written by Scottish authors, or at least authors who write stories that are set in Scotland, like Anne Cleeves, the author of the Shetland series, who is English. This book is lovingly curated and put together with so much care and comes with a lot of extras. Like, there is this map here at the end with all the sites on which the stories are set. And each of the sites gets its own description page in a sort of glossary at the end. And in front of each story, there is a picture of the site, Forth Bridge here. The stories themselves, however, are a different story. I guess it's hard to develop a believable and plausible crime plot in the space of 20 pages, especially if you want to make it a mystery. That's even harder to pull off, especially if you usually write lengthy novels. Most authors seem to have taken on more than they could chew in 20 pages, and the results were either ridiculously implausible or, paradoxically, totally lame, because there was too much tell and not enough show. Lee Child's story, for instance, was a total yawn, which is unfortunate because it was my first encounter with Lee Child. Anne Cleeves, who writes the phenomenal Shetland books, her story was ridiculously overwrought and unbelievable, and it might have worked in a 600-page novel and if her main character were Jason Bourne, but the way it was, just no. And on top of it all, most authors also aren't skilled and interesting enough writers to pull off a short story in the first place. What stood out were Lin Anderson, E.S. Thompson, and Doug Johnston, who described very personal crimes and were very low-key and focused on the psychology. Chris Brookmeyer was just shy of being unbelievable, and he was funny, which made for a nice change. And Lin Anderson, E.S. Thompson, and also Stuart McBride were the best at actually incorporating the history and the function of the historical site on which their stories were set in their stories. I learned so much about lighthouse keeping and its politics, more than I had ever wanted to know. But all in all, yeah, this is a nice book to have, not least because of its phenomenal cover. But there's not much of literary value or of entertainment value in here. A little bit, but not much. And finally, I read 3 full-length historical romances by Tamara Ellen. You might remember Tamara Ellen from my February wrap-up. I'll link it down below and in the cards. She is the author of Whistling in the Dark, which is a lovely, huge romance set in New York in 1919, so just at the beginning of the Jazz Age. And I was very impressed with this little gem of a book, especially compared to the rest of the romance genre, historical romance genre, I should say, because A, it is actually well written and written with some writerly ambition, and B, it is an actual historical novel and not just porn with a historical setting or pseudo-historical setting. And it is the same with all the rest of her books. Now, I was initially disappointed after I had read Whistling in the Dark. I was going to read all of her other books, but was disappointed when I couldn't get them in any shop online. Now, the reason for that is that they are actually free online. So I binge read Downtime, which was in fact published under the pen name James Allen, and The Only Gold, and The Road to Silver Plume. Now, Downtime is the exception here, I guess, which is her first book and is a rather run-of-the-mill historical and paranormal romance, I'm afraid. And the writing style, either she hadn't developed it at that point, or maybe since it was her first book and she wanted to get it published, she was reluctant to stray too far from the beaten path. It seems that romance readers are particularly intolerant when it comes to things like that, I'm afraid. So the story here is that an FBI agent who is for some reasons working with a secret agent in London, it seemed like the author had gotten her agencies mixed up, but I'm not an expert in this. So in any case, there's this FBI agent in London and he gets whisked into the past rather by accident by some people who are reading a spell from a book in the British Library. So he gets transported into 1888 and falls in love with one of the group, and also gets it into his head that it might be a good idea to look into the Jack the Ripper case. So like I said, that was pretty run-of-the-mill, and it also had some awkward plot holes or logical fallacies where the time travel aspects were concerned. And of course, time travel stories often have those problems, but it's usually enough for the author to acknowledge them in some way, and then the reader or the audience will be persuaded to accept them or to excuse them. But this didn't happen in this book, so that was a problem. And so this was nothing to write home about, but the other two books were fantastic. They are both set in 1889, and The Only Gold is set in New York City in a bank, and it culminates in a heist story and is set in a snowstorm, the heist, that is. And The Road to Silver Plume is a road trip story, only, of course, set on a train, which then turns into a western at the end of the story. There's quite a lot of action, but it never feels exaggerated and unbelievable. They are both full of historical detail, especially The Road to Silver Plume, which is about coin forgery. And I learned so much about coinage and currency in the USA at the end of the 19th century. There is one thing, though, that always frustrates me a little, or at least perplexes me a little, with Tamara Ellen's books and also with her short stories or novellas that I have read, which I will also link down below together with a link to the novels. And the thing that perplexes me is that she will often bring up a social issue, or the social issue is even the point of departure for the story. And she will follow the social criticism up to some point and then just backtrack and take a conventional or conservative stance. And I never know what to make of it. I never know if that's her actual position or if she's just careful not to tread on anyone's toes, because that's bad for sales in the romance genre, like I said earlier. I think that's a bit of a shame because in all other respects her historical novels are phenomenal, and I hope that there will be more in the future. So that's it for my April wrap-up part 2. I'm sorry, you may have noticed that I had to switch cameras towards the end, and this one that I'm using right now doesn't have a very good microphone, so I'm sorry about the drop in quality towards the end. I hope that you are all doing and reading very well, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!